Well, well, well. Look what has happened. Hasbro and Larian have cut ties. Swen himself has come out and said, no, there isn't going to be a Baldur's Gate 4. There will be no DLC. We are done. And he's given like statements like that before. Hasbro's confirmed it. They're trying to move in their own directions, trying to recover the brand of Dungeons and Dragons after Larian just butchered it so badly. I'm sure Hasbro is fuming at just the current state of Larian, like how much money they must have lost, how much like they how much they put into this, only for Baldur's Gate 3 to be completely forgotten within a couple of months of launch, right? After launch, right? Like they are done. And before anybody like tries to tell me that like, oh, but they won a Game of the Year award, the Game of the Year awards are rigged. Okay, like we have a gaming controversy right now regarding like the validity of gaming journalism as a whole in the West, right? You really think the Game Award means something? Oh, but it sold a lot. Not as much as Hogwarts Legacy, not as much as Zelda, not as much as Call of Duty, right? Baldur's Gate 3 was not the big major success that the industry tried to pretend it was, right? If it was, why are Larian and Hasbro breaking up like a bitter couple? Right? like if it was that successful, Hasbro would be on hands and knees. Oh, make some more RPGs for us, Larian. You're the best in the world. No, what they're doing is like the CD Projekt Red thing, where like they think they can strike out on their own and make a big new IP that like surpasses Baldur's Gate 3, surpasses Dungeons and Dragons, right? And obviously that's never going to happen. The only reason Baldur's Gate 3 had any traction whatsoever was because of like the built-in D&D audience, but when you when you think about this, like what happened with CG Project Red, how it won Game of the Year like for The Witcher 3 twice in a row, right? It won like 2016 as well because of the Blood and Wine DLC. All of that hype, all of that energy, all of that enthusiasm for a game, Cyberpunk 2077, which completely failed at launch and basically killed the entire company. Right? Anybody saying that like, oh, the DLC saved it is delusional. Just like people who try to say that like Alan Wake 2 was financially successful and not simply a result of like the ESG like social like sweet baby thing. Like these games are not popular is kind of what I've been saying for the longest time. And I think we are starting to see the cracks when it comes to Baldur's Gate 3. For example, right, Tears of the Kingdom is far more talked about and beloved than Baldur's Gate 3 is at this point. People are still talking about and playing Tears of the Kingdom long after they've forgotten about Baldur's Gate 3, right? Tears of the Kingdom has remained very much relevant over the past year, whereas like Baldur's Gate 3 was dropped like a hot potato after it served its purpose of winning a game award to try and keep the discussion away from like actual valid options. You know, like it's the game served its purpose, right? To try and keep people from acknowledging Nintendo as being superior, right? It's like that's all the industry really needed from it. But uh, with Zelda being a legitimately good video game, of course it's going to continue being talked about. Just like Metroid Prime was continue to be talked about. Just like Super Mario World or like any of these all-time classics. Like they're always going to remain relevant because they are genuinely good games. Anyone who tries to like paint like Tears of the Kingdom as a disappointment is just straight up delusional, a fool, right? Like Tears of the Kingdom mogs everything else that came out that year, other than maybe like Super Mario Bros. Wonder, right? Like Tears of the Kingdom was like a phenomenal video game, and absolutely should have been acknowledged more for its accomplishments. But no, we had to put on this facade. We had to like dance to the monkey's tune, right? We had to like pretend that like it has competition, that like Elden Ring is better, that Dragon's Dogma is better, that like Witcher 3 is better. Like I don't know, like Like we had to keep up this like ruse. We had to give it this facade because like we can't we can't be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that like Nintendo is simply superior to the other companies, right? What is Swen doing right now? He's doing that like that virtue signaling thing where he's just like, oh, I don't like how these publishers treat their developers. I've seen publishers like fire entire teams of developers. And like they haven't built up talent at all. Like nobody in the industry does it the right way. Like he's completely neglecting to mention the fact that like Nintendo does not do that, right? He completely neglects to mention the fact that like Iwata um, famously chose not to lay off any of his staff in favor of because he knew that cultivating talent at Nintendo would pay off in the long run. And what happened? The Switch was a major success. They put out banger after banger after banger after banger. And now Nintendo is like one of the best companies to work for in Japan right now, right? With a solid 40-hour work week, great benefits, a pretty solid like employee retention rate. Like they are just like they are killing it right now. And meanwhile, like fucking like Chucklefuck Swen is coming out like in a full suit of armor, trying to convince us like, oh, the industry, it's kind of terrible right now for the developer. No, it's terrible for those of you who failed to acknowledge Nintendo as the viable partner going forward, right? Whenever I see developers or journalists complain about the current state of gaming, right? The way developers are treated, the publishers, like I ask them, how did you treat Nintendo for the past 25 years? Right? Because Nintendo is the company that maintains its company ethically. They're the company that keeps costs low, right? They're the company that respects its employees, respects its partners to great length, more than I think they should, to be completely honest with you, right? Like Nintendo is the company that's doing everything you say they should do. And what happens? Every single time you spit in their face, right? The Game Awards for the 2023 were simply like one example of this, but you really can like just pick out like at random, some developer like smack talking Nintendo or like talking down to them. I talked about DSP the other day and how he like rambled about like, oh, Switch is just a children's toy. Like you have like Yakuza Nagoshi like insisting that like Yakuza would never ever ever come out on Switch. Like after the actually before the Wii U ports of Yakuza 1 and 2 were released, right? You have all these like situations, all these like, insane people, right? Super Mario Bros. Wonder, right? Like how many people like refuse to acknowledge that game was like a 10 out of 10 platformer, right? Like how many people like refuse to acknowledge that was a great game? You know, like they did the same thing with New Super Mario Bros. U and Wii, right? Like great platformers all around, but at the time, game journalists were able to like create this narrative that like, oh, actually these games are terrible because they don't innovate enough, right? Which is like obviously a load of crap if you actually play them, but a lot of people believe that for a long time, right? And even now with Mario Wonder, like I think there's still this prevailing narrative that like the game is not a major release from Nintendo, right? Same with Princess Peach Showtime, right? Like, why are you so obsessed with downplaying everything Nintendo does, right? And I am tired of seeing this. I am tired of seeing game journos like prop up mediocre personalities like Swen because they have nothing else to discuss, right? I'm sick of having to deal with like just random titles from random developers that like really have no business competing with Switch at all. Got the guys behind Biomutant, right? The guys like who produced Rayman Legends, right? Remember when Rayman Legends was like supposedly a better platformer than New Super Mario Bros. U, right? Remember that? Like, who do you know today who still cares about Rayman Legends? Who do you know who even cares that like Michael Ansel retired and became like a wildlife conservationist, right? Who do you even know? Who do you know who cares that Beyond Good and Evil 2 never got made, right? Nobody cares, right? even though that developer, those titles like were hyped as like superior alternatives to Nintendo titles. I'm old enough where I remember game journalists telling us that like Beyond Good and Evil is better than Zelda, guys. It's way better than Wind Waker. I remember being told it was like one of the best games of the generation, and it's just not that good. Like it really isn't. I've always felt that way. I've always maintained that. Even looking back on it, I kind of uh, I kind of laugh at like just how brazen they were on it about that. Pretending this was like one of the best third-party games on GameCube. But now, like looking back on it, like who do you see today who remembers like Beyond Good and Evil fondly? It's one of those games like hyped up by game journalists and forgotten by everyone else. And Baldur's Gate 3 is absolutely of the same ilk.